So good morning, good afternoon, and good night to all of you who are with us all over the world. We are initiating now the last part of our annual meeting of the Brazilian Network of Science for Education, where we intend to put together a number of researchers from all over the world to exchange their experiences on the problems created by the pandemic and the solutions that we might develop to mitigate these problems. We will have two roundtables, and one will be chaired by Bob Wise. Bob Wise is a distinguished politician from the United States who is doing an incredible job in putting together a global initiative to foster science of learning internationally. And he will chair the first session, the first roundtable, and I myself will chair the second roundtable. The Brazilian Network of Science for Education is an association of over 150 researchers right now who are interested in congregating scientists from all disciplines together with teachers to investigate, find, and try to scale up scientific solutions, scientific propositions based on science in favor of education. So please, Bob, introduce yourself, and then we'll start with the first roundtable.
Well, thank you very much, Roberto. It's a pleasure to be with you, and thank you to you and your colleagues for this important set of panel discussions, as well as your leadership in numerous international efforts to bring science to improving education. Thank you again, Roberto, for this opportunity. This is an important conference and excited to be participating with you. I represent in one of the co-founders, and several, you've been one, and certainly Dr. Cheeber, Professor Andrea Cheeber as well, of the Global Science of Learning Education Network, GSOLEN, or as we call it, GSOLEN. So with the global network, and we're glad to be able to collaborate with you, at this point, we're now over 600 education researchers, scientists, and educators in more than 60 nations to address pressing issues in education, and particularly how we respond and come out of COVID-19, and to bring attention to science-informed strategies for implementation that work in international contexts. And the good news is that through conferences like this, our number and our communication of all of us is steadily growing. The statistics, as you know, are quite glaring. UNESCO reported 18 months ago that 1.5 billion students were pulled out of school in about 190 nations. Over 63 million teachers were affected. And so now, but significantly, the OECD in a survey of its members reported that 80% of its members coming out of COVID, sought to improve their systems, not just return them to the conditions that existed before the pandemic. So how do we take this crisis and all the different strategies that countries across the world are seeking to and infuse science into those important decisions? The Global Science of Learning Education Network is undertaking several key activities. Many of the people that I see on before me are participating in those, and we thank you. We create working groups where subjects are identified by member or GSOLAN members, and then they form working groups to share information. The Teacher Support Network is our most active working group right now, exploring the relationships that are necessary between teachers and students and teachers and teachers. We also have the Digital Learning Working Group, and just forming now, and one I'm excited about as well, is what we call the Knowledge Brokering Working Group. That is how we quickly translate knowledge, scientific knowledge, that then gets put into implementation in various and is sensitive to culture and region and nation. So I just also want to note, and Dr. Chiba will talk about this, I'm sure, in the second panel, one of the other major global network activities is developing the Global Science of Learning Education Network Community Square. The objective is to accelerate the sharing of information about research, strategies, and examples of successful implementation by building both a human and a technology infrastructure for rapid and accelerated information sharing. So it is important that this conference and many like it are occurring across the world. If you think about it right now, a conference is taking place that the world is watching in Glasgow on global climate change. Now the world has begun to realize the crisis we're in. In some ways, there are parallels here. And so the important work that is being done by this conference and others, now we have to make sure that that information is shared. And the results of the work in Brazil and other nations to hear the teacher's voice can inform important decisions. What is important from this collective work is that we work together to develop rapid information sharing. And just as policymakers have been slow to respond to climate change, but are now accelerating, we believe that the COVID pandemic and that has highlighted, demonstrated the inequities in our education system that existed before have now greatly expanded people's understanding of them. This is probably one of the single greatest shared experiences that the world has had. As one noted international observer said, for the first time, the world is a single education laboratory in terms of what it is that's working in education and how can we disseminate it. And so this is an opportunity, we believe. Now the world's educators, policymakers, and public must make both short and long-term decisions. GSOLAN is dedicated to working together to ensure that the science of learning and the decisions are connected rapidly and effectively to benefit all the world's learners. And anyone who's interested in learning more, we encourage you just to go to Global Science of Learning Education Network, or if you can see the website address behind me on my poster, please just contact us. No fees, no requirements, simply to share information with your colleagues across the world and see how we can accelerate progress. And so thank you, Roberto, but more importantly, this panel addressing their perceptions of the pandemic and its impact in their countries and what it is that needs to be done. We have a number of noted panelists, and so if I could, we'll start with Cecilia Calero, and if you would give us some insights on your experiences.
Hi. Well, hi, everyone. Thank you, Bob. Thank you, Roberto. And thank you very much to the Brazilian Network of Science of Education for this invitation to participate in this roundtable. My name is Cecilia Calero, and I'm the director of the education area at Torquato de Itela University, and I'm an appointed researcher at the National Scientific and Technical Research Council in Argentina. So here we are to talk about the worst impacts of the pandemic, and I would like to share with you a little bit of the situation in Argentina in terms of what is happening with education. I think that these conferences find us in a particular moment, because although we are still living in times of great uncertainty, I mean, we are still dealing with an active circulation of the virus and with sanitary conditions and measures that change, that go back and forward, setting the different kind of restrictions in terms of what we can do and what we should do. It's also true that after 18 plus months since the start of the pandemic, and with the pace of vaccination and with the numbers experienced, live and evaluated, this could also be a really good time to slow down and to generate a space for debate, to know how we can contribute and support the educational policies that we will need for the coming years. Having said that, and given the time that I have, I would like to focus on three things. And first, I would like to highlight that these are not things that are new problems, at least not in Argentina, that they not appear with the pandemic. These are all acquaintances, but we have been living and dealing with them for a very long time. And the COVID-19 crisis made them clearly worse. And I will be referring to three problems. That is the school dropout, gender gaps, and mental health care for the educational community. The numbers from the Ministry of Education from last June in 2020 report that 1.1 million children were detected to have dropped out from their schools. Sometimes this number is not called dropout. It's like they are not being in link or vinculated with the school. But the thing is that this number, either we call it dropout or not, represent 10% of the total students that make up for the enrollment in the initial primary and secondary levels in Argentina. From that survey, what appears and what it made clear is that with those numbers, we needed to do something. And some programs likely appear aiming to find how to relink the students, the validity and how good these programs are being implemented is yet to be discussed. I mean, we need to make more work, we need more numbers, but they are reported in March 2020 that there are at least, that those are the available numbers that I have, the newest one, proposed that only 1/3 of the students, given those efforts from the past 6 months, only 1/3 of the students have been recovered. So we have a real problem. 2/3 of our students, of those students who disconnect in 2020 in June, still are not connected with their respective schools. So we have a real problem relinking, bringing them back. And again, we all know that, as you can imagine, a school dropout during the suspension of classes was especially worst in vulnerable students, and those will be the most difficult to recover. We know that from that population, almost 65% of those students will not come back to school. So we need to do something. There has been some studies in Argentina trying to somehow disentangle and understand the reasons why this dropout occur, and it's still a problem. And the reasons that are starting to appear in the literature is that this disengagement emerged differently from different types of schools. So some research show that if we look at the public schools, the main two factors for this disengagement and this idea of not going back to school that complicated the pedagogical continuity is having little or no access to technology and to connectivity. Almost 100% of the schools that we have been studying or working with report these kind of problems. And the second condition was the second most mentioned condition was the poor the poor conditions for studying at home. So having little to no space, having no time. Many of these students had to take care of their own siblings, they also have to go out to work to bring back some money to the house, and there's a lot of noise and interruption at the schools. So we can see how this had an impact in their continuity, their pedagogical continuity, and it still is having some kind of impact in them going back to school. And if we look at private school, the connection problems is not among the most mentioned. So technology and connectivity is not the key problem, but the most pointing out barrier was the adaptation to these new teaching strategies, right? So being in a classroom, in a virtual classroom, learning through these new elements was the most mentioned thing in private school. And in public school, I mean, it's not like this wasn't a problem, but they have so many other issues that is not even mentioned among the top 3. So just to give you an idea, these numbers show that the main contact between the public schools and the students from very vulnerable conditions was WhatsApp. So therefore, we are dealing in Argentina with a significant problems in terms of dropout and relink students, and we need more data, not only knowing what happened with those students, but also what are the conditions and the solutions that we could afford to this to deal with this problem. Now, in terms of gender gaps, Bob already mentioned UNESCO, and one of the UNESCO report said that 11 million girls might not return to school. And even though I don't have the specific numbers from Argentina, we unfortunately expect that in Argentina there will be a similar trend that in the rest of the world, when girls' education is cut short, the impact affects us for generations. And Latin America in general, before the pandemic, had one of the widest gender gaps in learning outcomes in the world. So we know that this is going to be really bad in Latin America and in Argentina. And given the time, I would like to give you just a quote of one of the papers from Mercedes Mateo Diaz, who put it in a much better way that I could, and say that our challenge in what is to come is not to convince girls or their families to go to school, but to encourage them to stay in school, to learn, and to truly believe that the sky is the limit. We need to let them know that they don't just own a plane, they also have the right to fly it. Girls should know that they can be good in any subject, that this is fine to choose a scientific or a technical career, and also that eventually their efforts will pay and contribute to improve their future quality of lives. So, and I would like to add that this should be a main focus in education in years to come, and we need numbers. If we want to do something about it, we need the numbers from Argentina, and unfortunately we don't have those. And finally, and very, very briefly, I would like to at least bring up to this conversation the topic of mental health care for the educational community. In general, not only students, but also, of course, for teachers, for principals, for families, for all the educational community. Here we don't have enough numbers, and we need, again, those numbers to promote evidence-based discussions. We need to produce reports in all aspects regarding health, well-being, mental health, and to be able to really support the community and to create really good and a very solid educational policy regarding this subject. And here we're starting to have some numbers. So there are some studies, for example, I recommend the studies from Cecilia Lopez-Stames and Juan Carlos Godoy and collaborators, who show that depression got worse and worse with quarantine, as quarantine went by. Anxiety and suicidal risk also follow that pattern. And moreover, and linking to gender gaps, being a young woman with some sort of mental health history had an increasing in the risk effects on those indicators. So as we expect, quarantine was or had a negative effect on mental health, and we need to pay more attention to these numbers, and to start, and by start I mean like yesterday, right? We really need to get this, to start with this now, to think how we're going to help and we're going to accompany the educational community. So there are many things that I left out from this point in this presentation, but I hope that with these points I could give you like an idea or a picture of the situation of Argentina and education. So thank you very much.
And thank you, Cecilia, because what you have done in describing Argentina is, I believe you've laid a foundation for discussion of what's happening across the world. Dropouts, children not returning, the problems with connectivity in many cases, and the one that I think is a sleeper because data doesn't carry it, it's hidden, but it's the problem of mental health and what happens to children over 18 months and their parents and their teachers of being continually stressed. At this point, let me now turn to Professor Marcela Pena to discuss Chile and her experiences.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Well, thank you for inviting me to this interesting and necessary type of meeting. I have a PowerPoint to project. Is possible I share? Okay, can I share my PowerPoint? It's okay for you?
I defer to the technology person. I believe it is.
Okay.
Yes, that's fine. You can share.
Okay, thank you. It's just to have something like more like that. Well, thank you for inviting me. I am Marcela Peña. I am a pediatrician, medical doctor, and I have done a PhD in linguistics and cognitive psychology. I'm working currently as professor at the University, Catholic University of Chile, and in the laboratory of cognitive neuroscience. So my research and what we have put attention in the last year is to explore whether what we do in the laboratory, it could be useful for educators. And specifically in our laboratory, we have explored how the baby, the young infant and the preschooler learn the language. And also we have our laboratory is neuroscience, so we also have explored where the brain reacts to this, how is the plasticity to explain when you are learning or not in a good way from different type of stimulus. So I'm going to show you what is the relationship of this study with the world impact of the pandemic. The first one is that, as you already know, that UNESCO say that there are a lot of billions of mostly children that have been affected by the pandemic situation for many reasons. And in Chile, we have done, our group, but another group of the Catholic University, led by Abu Fele, the group of Abu Fele. And they have evaluated how the different abilities, the social abilities, the linguistic abilities, executive function, and also general cognition abilities in the 2020, in the 20s, at the end of the 2020s, after the long period that we had of quarantine. The quarantine in Chile was about 500 days, not for all the population, but for different group of persons. And the quarantine, the how can I say, the social distance, we can say social distance in this case, was affected more the areas of the Chile that were more poor. The poverty was a factor for where we found more higher levels of contamination, because of course they live all together in many people in the same house. So they were very much exposed to the possibility to have a contagion. And also because they were forced to go to work, etc. So they have forced to go to different places where you can take the virus. So finally, they evaluated the 240 children from 3 to 4 years that they were exploring. They were previously evaluated in 2017. So I'm going to show you what they found. They explored the gap against what was the scores that the children showed in 2017. So this is the line for the 2017, the red line. And here in general development, they found here that they reduces the gap, increases the gap, but because in 2020, the scores in general development was much smaller. They also found similar in vocabulary, evaluated by the people that test the vocabulary of the children. They also found another loss here that is in social emotional. In this case, the higher score indicate more higher loss. So they were really affected in general development, general cognitive abilities, also in vocabulary and also in social emotional development. Unfortunately, they found also that in executive function, the children maintaining a sort of a gain, positive gain. They didn't lose in executive function. They somehow, I think the situation somehow forced the children to really adapt to the situation, and this developed the executive function in some way. So with this panorama, with this scenario, we can say that, of course, the pandemic situation that we have now, it has, Cecilia have just said, that the absenteeism is forced. You cannot go to school, and in Chile was already in 2017 was really can rise up at 48% in children in preschooler. Especially the people who leave the children who are growing up in poverty, and this absence associated to a very important language delay. So they had already a very low condition, if you want. Before the pandemic, they were already low. So now, when we say they have lost some abilities for communication, for instance, these are really amazing because it's even more than what they have previous to in the period previous to the pandemic. So in this case, well, a good news in the middle of this stuff that the vaccination apparently is doing some type of control of the situation. So not everything is terribly bad. And but when we explored what are the cause, the possible reason to explain why the children are in a very bad situation, the preschooler are in a very bad situation, is also because in our country, at least, even if we have a internet connection, the educators and the parents and the families in general, even the preschoolers, they were not trained to learn from this interactive or in this remote way. They didn't know exactly, you know, maybe when you have a primary school, or you say you are in the fourth grade, and you say, okay, you put in front of the computer and do something. But in the preschooler, you cannot. The preschooler goes, watch the screen, usually it's not very interested and go away. So it's not really the training that the educator have to skills, have to excel in this type of connection with the children by the screen, and also allow to the children and to the parents to provide a guide. So I think we have, at least in our country, this was this poor training in remote education and in remote learning. How can a preschooler can learn from the remote situation, from the remote education? It must be trained, and we have done some initiative about that. So the idea was to train the people to prepare some sort of protocols to evaluate what we have to say to the children, how we can get attention, how we can really train the parent, because the parent many times have several children at home, and how they can just prepare for some specific protocol. So I think this has been very useful, at least to confront at least the contact with the children, with the preschool once a day. I cannot tell you that it will be all the day, but at least once a day, you can connect with them and train some abilities, particularly directed to vocabulary and emotional and social-emotional development. So there are many other factors, of course. This is multidimensional, and we cannot say that this just it's not just the lack of training in this specific skill for remote education, but and many other are super important, like inequality that, you know, in Latin America is so big, particularly in Chile is enormously big. Yeah. So other factors like poverty, stress, etc., are also extremely important. I think it's all together. So I'm going to show you that what we have done we cannot, I think these many causes we cannot evaluate in our laboratory, and we are just focusing in what we can do from far. And we have developed some games, educational games that we wanted to, technological solutions that I'm going to show you that this technological solution can help. They are not directed to replace nothing, to replace, of course, the educator has to be, is the most important factor in the education of the preschoolers, and also in especially when you go to the family. But the fact that the educator can tell the mother, for instance, okay, I will give you this game and you can play with the children for 15 minutes a day. This is it's very well perceived as a tool for educators. They say, okay, I don't see the child, I have a connection with them by the screen or by the virtual format. But however, when I'm not there, I can give you to the parents an information, you know, a game where we can evaluate what just we can promote the vocabulary for the infant. So I'm going to show you some studies.
Could we make this the last slide? We're on a tight time, and that there's so much important information here.
Sorry, I don't understand.
Oh no, I'm asking if it'd be possible to wrap up this part of the presentation. I know that the PowerPoint deck will be made available to all participants, but we're time sensitive.
Ah, okay. You need I can finish.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. Okay. Of course, I'm going to just show you that with using this type of intervention that we can play like that. I'm going just come to show this video. It's possible. It's very fun. Well, we teach the infant some vocabulary, and this and we can use technology. Just we can train mothers and educators to play and to stimulate the vocabulary in the children. So I can just stop here. I don't need to show you the result, but believe me that this is a very good, when you have not other alternatives, like the possibility to attend to school, or the possibility that the educator can catch up the engagement of the children, you can use this type of initiative and intervention to promote language or other ability like social-emotional at home.
Thank you very much, because this covers another important worldwide area of early childhood. At this point, let me invite Tracy Tokuhama Espinosa to talk about her experience and also to express my gratitude for her conducting 3 separate video conferences for the Global Science of Learning Network.
Thank you so much, Bob, and really, it's really an honor for me to share this virtual stage with all of these esteemed colleagues and to hear about this excellent work that's going on around the world. I teach a course at Harvard University Extension School. It's called the Neuroscience of Learning. And we are also doing a special issue in the Nature Partner Journal on the science of learning, looking at the lasting impact that COVID has had on the changing educational landscape. And so all of these ideas are really expressed well, and it contributes to a lot of the information we have from around the world. In the short time that I have to try to keep within the time frame of just a few minutes, I wanted to use maybe 3 or 4 concepts from the learning sciences and then offer 5 or 6 examples concretely from Ecuador and from the United States, basically observations that we've had of what has happened during these times of COVID. So first and foremost, in order to address COVID or any other problem situation as a teacher or a policymaker, you first have to define the terms. And the main problem that many of us had at the beginning of COVID almost 2 years ago is that nobody had a prior experience to use to be able to plan and to look ahead and what needed to happen, because we never lived through that before. Since all new learning, passes through this filter of prior experience, we looked for what we already knew about the problem, and we didn't really have a lot of information. And so that made us go to a tier 2 kind of an intervention, which is to, when you don't have something that's necessarily easy to associate with a problem, what is COVID? We don't know how to respond to this in education. You should probably use an analogy. Analogies are a good second best option when you don't have prior knowledge of something. Can we use metaphorical thinking or analogies? And in the case of COVID, rather than think of COVID as a problem, a lot of teachers that we worked with began to look at this as a catalyst. And if we use an analogy, COVID began to be seen as more like a spotlight or a magnifying glass or the volume dial on a speaker, which sort of amplified and magnified our understanding of already existing problems. I think Cecilia really put her finger on the pulse of things when she pointed out that none of these things that we began to now dig deeper into are new. In fact, they're old problems. But thanks to COVID, and I know it's horrible to attribute something positive to something that was so negative, but we've now begun to really see the origins of many of the problems in education that have always existed. And so basically this gets to maybe 6 examples I'd like to call out from Ecuador and from the United States, which happened simultaneously. And to put this into context as far as numbers are concerned, right now I'm living in New York, and Ecuador, they have about the same rate of vaccination, believe it or not. Both the city of New York and the country of Ecuador have about 70% of the population vaccinated. And that permits people to go back to school. They actually started to go back to school, but with a very new lens on things. So teachers in the classrooms, as well as policymakers, were thinking about different issues. And the 6 issues I want to highlight just sort of put into play another idea from the learning sciences, which is that a good diagnosis is half of the cure to the problems that we might face. And so we realized, I'm going to name a couple of problems and then maybe point out some of the things that we realized were at the roots of that, which are now pointing to very promising areas for policy decision making. The first is that many kids were going without education. We knew this before COVID even hit, but it really called out the inequities that exist around the world. And it also did something that Cecilia pointed out. It highlighted that the internet, which the United Nations is now labeled as a human right, it's not just a luxury, but this is something that everybody should have access to. It also sped up this acceptance of technology as a support system for education. And so what are some of the things we gained from this? And some of the research, I think that Marcelo was so good in her details, but I'm going to talk in more global terms just for time. We now know where these populations are that were not being attended. It was really glaring that the inequities in many rural areas of Ecuador, as well as in the rural parts of the United States, people who didn't have access to internet, people who didn't have tablets on hand, people who had to share one computer device for the whole family, and they were working from home, but also maybe the parent was even a teacher and having to teach and learn, and the father was having to use the computer for his work. All of these things pointed out really specific populations and really more precise interventions. A second problem that we faced, or that we saw, is that many teachers have left the profession. COVID was the last straw. And this really brought to light and made society really value the teaching profession as a whole, and appreciate all of the things that teachers really did, and realize that it's something that we depend on, but we'd taken for granted. And this also made us look at, see this idea that society has finally, I believe, accepted that teachers are really the linchpin in development. And this called attention to this new professional development that's needed for teachers to be able to function in the current world. It also accelerated this concept when teachers started to leave, of more an international schoolhouse. For those systems that did have internet but didn't have teachers who were good at teaching, we saw many creative insights. For example, a great math teacher in Ecuador ended up teaching in Florida and in Spain when those places didn't have teachers. And so we saw a very different role for teachers on an international scale. A third problem that we encountered, and everybody has seen, is that parents had to support their kids in their home learning, which was interesting, but we've always known, it takes a village to raise a child. But the appreciation of this home and school partnership was really thrown into the forefront. And it's something that we presume will not be lost when we go back to regular schooling. As Bob pointed out, the OECD really threw a magnifying glass onto the issues of the haves and have-nots. It's really clear that school systems that were already good, weathered this fine, and school systems that were bad, really, some of them lost more than an entire year of schooling. And so this showed, though, how we need more international cooperation. It forced almost a global response in terms of vaccines and technology and education onto the scene, which helps us now actually celebrate this kind of a concept of 1 + 1 is 3. You have a good system, I have a good system, but if we share it, we may have a better response to the problem than if we try to go it alone. So isolated interventions are not necessarily as impacting as ones that are used in a global sense, right? A fifth problem that we had was that we showed how people are totally vulnerable in this huge issue of social emotional learning. It made social emotional learning within schools mainstream. It was only, even 10 years ago, you would never think that schools were responsible for the emotional well-being of a child. But we realized that that was huge, and that was a big part of learning. And so that became incorporated. But we also found that speaking with the school district, the public schools in Hawaii, the superintendent has pointed out that between 25 and 30% of students and teachers don't want to go back. And when you try to look at, well, what are the root causes of this? There's many different reasons. Some have to do with kids who experienced bullying beforehand, or just the distance to get to school, or that the pace of learning was better for them when they were at home. So this was really throwing a monkey wrench into their system of everybody has to go back, because there are some people we see, and this is even happening in the workplace, right? Some people don't want to go back now. So what do we do about that? And how will that create a presence for technology and education from here on out, okay? It also brought attention to this idea that it's okay not to be okay, and that people need people. And whether or not that be in looking at our faces in Zoom or going to a masked classroom, people need to be with each other. And the last point I'll make here is that we saw how many of us had to move everything to a Zoom format like we're in right now. And for one thing, we realized there's a lot of stuff you can do without having to go into the office, which was really kind of interesting, right? But it's also added a very interesting flavor to meetings. And maybe Roberto will even say that this has happened with this particular meeting for Brazil. But almost all meetings now, and especially conferences like this one, now consider international participation. And this has moved a new agenda of international transdisciplinary thinking that hopes to generate this kind of translational science that brings this to to the average person. So in summary, I just to say that we need to have clear definitions of what we're focused on, that all the new learning passes through this filter of prior experience, and we're just now coming to grips of what it means to deal with a pandemic. But we have to use the analogies that are in front of us to be able to laser focus in on what real problems are, and using a good diagnosis is going to be half the cure. So I'd like to just reiterate this, terribly worn out idea that, every problem is an opportunity. But I think that this one has allowed us to focus on problems in education that have been around for a long time, which we now finally have a very precise way that we can create policies around responses to them. So thank you very much. And I look forward to also hearing the rest of the speakers and gaining more knowledge from you all. Thank you.
Thank you, Tracy. I always appreciate a lot of points in a short period of time and much to think about. And so let's turn now to Gregoire Borst. Thank you for your participation.
Hi, everyone. Thanks a lot for the invitation. I'm sorry I'm in Rabat because I have to give a conference tomorrow, so I hope it goes through. But I will speak for France and the effect of COVID on France and more generally on Europe, and the type of things we've been doing in the lab regarding this issue. I'll try to share my screen just to show you a couple of slides that I prepared. It should work eventually. So I'm a professor of developmental psychology and cognitive neuroscience of education, and I'm the director of the laboratory for the study of child development and education in La Sorbonne. And it's been one of the first actually scientific lab in France. It actually was directed by Alfred Binet, and Jean Piaget did an internship in this lab. So it's a kind of a very old lab, and we've been very interested in my lab in basically understanding the learning law of the learning law of the brain, basically. And we study also cognitive development, and we do a lot of translational research toward education. And we do a lot of action to basically promote science of learning to the teachers. And so in this context, we created this blog, scientific blog called Le 21 du Lapsidé, which is here. A part of it is in French, but each and every article is translated in English. So if you're interested, you can look it up and you can see a bit what we're doing in the lab, basically. So I just wanted to give you a bit of data, because like in France and in Europe, we've been actually collecting a lot of data about like the effect of the COVID crisis. Especially in France, we had like since now 3 years, we implemented like national evaluation for first graders and second graders. So we can basically try to pinpoint what has been happening due to COVID on basically school achievement, school learning, and what could be the factor we need to be worried of, and have a bit of critical thinking about it. I'm sorry, like part of it is in French, but I'll translate it quickly. But like what they looked was like the difference between the evaluation they ran in 2019, in September of 2019, and the one they ran in September of 2020. And so what you're looking here is the proportion of students that actually achieve what they were supposed to achieve in each of these different domains of either literacy or numeracy. So literacy is on the left, numeracy is on the right. And as you can see, for each and every aspects of literacy and numeracy, basically, the students underperformed in 2020 as in comparison of 2019. The interesting thing here is that it's a national evaluation. So each and every student actually went through those evaluations. So this is basically what you can get at the scope of a global country level. So, I mean, I'm not going to go into detail, but it's just to show you the type of data we have and the type of data. And I'm going to show you what the Ministry of Education is basically launching to have a long-term evaluation of the effect of COVID and the school closure in France. I mean, again, like school closure in France has been like very actually narrowing in time. So we only closed the school for 8 weeks, 8 to 10 weeks. So it's a bit different from other countries, but it's also a way to basically gain knowledge of what happened. And we have data on the students, but we also have data on the professors, the teachers, and the directors of schools. So all those data can be like looked looked at, and we can have like a general consensus of what has been going on. But I wanted to basically focus more on the question of the fact that actually, if you look at learning loss due to COVID, due to school closure, basically, it's not homogeneous. It's very heterogeneous. And of course, like students from low SES families have been more affected due to from school closure than any other students, basically. So if you look at the data from the Netherlands, they had like this national evaluation just before they closed the school and just after they reopened the school. And if you look at across the board, there's been like learning loss. Actually, the learning loss are almost like you can like associate this learning loss to the fact that apparently, from this data, they're suggesting that if you look at the learning gain that you should have like basically observed during this 8 weeks period of time, no learning gain was achieved during this time. So as if you close the school, there is no learning happening. I think it's essentially due to the fact that what were the competencies they were interested in, but it's just like a fact to say, well, we need to be a little bit, we need data basically. And we've been saying that a lot of time, like we need data from a lot of different countries, because that's a way to really assess what's going on when we close schools. Also take into account, and that's going to be like one of the message here is this is like when you assess what happened when the school were closed, basically, you don't assess only the effect of school closure. I mean, we've been all basically under a huge stress, and we know that stress is bad for learning, basically. And so most of the effect, I think, that we're looking at are maybe due to the chronic stress that teachers, but also students has been facing through the pandemic. So it's not necessarily school closure, the factor. It's school closure plus huge amount of stress. If you remember what happened, like in the beginning of the pandemic, like everyone was thinking that maybe 20% of the population might die because of the pandemic, and you can like think of how much stress it puts on basically the families, but also, of course, the students. And I just wanted to make the case like that we know for a long time that basically, like, why do we find like stronger effect of the school closure in students from low SES? Basically, because it's a cumulative process of chronic stress. So those are already children that are more exposed to chronic stress, and you add it through the pandemic, you add more chronic stress, and we know that chronic stress has a huge effect on brain development and all the basically neurocognitive systems that are involved in learning. So that's a causality. Basically, you have like low SES children are more exposed to chronic stress. I mean, of course, like on average, there is of course like specificities, but on average, they're more exposed to chronic stress. So they are more, they will like develop like higher level of cortisol. And unfortunately, we do have like cortisol receptor in the brain. And that explains why when you are under huge chronic stress, you tend to have like effect on learning gains, basically. So that's also the type of things we're trying to understand in France, and it's different type of causality that you can look at. And it's not only to look at like basically children or primary or preschoolers. We started to have data, and that's a study that is currently on PsychArchive that you can look at what happened to basically in adolescents due to this COVID crisis, and what they found was basically household and socioeconomic hardship has an effect on future of uncertainty and negative mood. But all of this is basically mediated by executive function. So there is also this idea that you can also look at this crisis on what it has as an impact on mood, on anxiety, on basically mental health, but it is also related to the type of functions and cognitive functions that we know are very important in learning. Executive functions are one of the predictors of school achievement. So if you think that school might also be in the next years to come a place where we need to foster those type of executive function competencies in order also to have an impact on the mental health of students. And I just wanted to close on that, to not take too much time, but showing you what we've been doing, like with children from low SES neighbors in Paris, where we found basically, and I'm going to go through it very quickly, but basically that when you look at the effect of SES across the board of language abilities and numerical abilities, all of this effect is mediated by the effect of SES on metacognition. And we found that you can actually design specific intervention to improve metacognition in 5 years old from low SES, and that actually has a positive impact on basically a wide range of literacy and numeracy skills. So that might be also something we should like take into account. Maybe the effect of COVID might be to put the focus for teachers on those domain general processes that we know are very important in all different type of learning, basically. And I just want to finish on that, and just to show you that basically the French Ministry of Education through its statistical department has been launching this study, which is called the DEX study, where they're going to follow for 2 years 1,000 schools and have data on both students, but also on teachers and school directors to assess really and finally, in a fine-grained manner, the effect of COVID on the long run. And I think that's the type of data we need, but we also need those data across different countries, not just in one country, because we know that context will have a different type of effects on depending of the different type of organization of the school system and so forth and so on. So we need to have like broader international studies precisely to assess like the effect of context on this detrimental effect of COVID and potentially sometimes on the potential positive effects, as we heard, of COVID on changing like also the way we think about education and the type of competency we need to foster in children in the future. Thanks a lot for your attention.
Thank you very much. This is important because learning loss is something that we're grappling with in every country, even defining it. And also in some cases, my personal observation is willingness to call it out and to accept it and say there has been learning loss. Now, what does that mean? It is not a statement about the child. It is a statement about an entire world situation that we have been in, but I believe my personal observation is we need to address it. But the more data, such as what you've gathered, others have gathered, presented here today, I know in the United States, the National Assessment of Education Progress, the only national test, in effect, that's administered, has shown a decline in reading and math scores among the populations tested during this period. So this combined, well, actually, I should not be doing the wrap up. That is Philippe's job, and he stands ready to do that. So a lot has been presented here today, and look forward, Philippe, to your wrap up.
Okay, you hear me?
Yes.
Wonderful. So thanks so much for the opportunity to do the wrap up. Thanks so much for all these very interesting talks. I learned a lot from these, and let me try to summarize a couple of main points that came across the different presentations. First of all, I think the pandemic is perceived by most as a challenge. Cecilia pointed immediately to the issue that it also immediately reminded us of the old problems. She was talking about dropout. She was talking about mental health problems that have been already a problem in many education systems around the world. So I really think that this is an important one. I think if there's a challenge, we are able to deal with that. We are genetically and evolutionarily equipped to deal with this. And the fact that we organize this kind of conference here, bringing scientists together with professional people and with policy people, I think this is a really important contribution on how we can deal with all this. When the pandemic hit us, the majority of the people were really concerned about learning losses, like Bob was just talking about, and Grégoire. And we were all scared about closing schools, what the impact of the pandemic would be on academic achievement, on results that the children would have in education, on language, on math, on a bunch of other subjects like science and so on and so forth. But I've been advising in the past the OECD on the assessment of social emotional skills, and I was really concerned about what the impact of the pandemic would be, and children staying in their home environments. And not all these home environments, many of the speakers today pointed to that, are not ideal home environments. Sometimes they have to work, sometimes they do not even have a separate corner to make homework. There are a lot of trouble with internet connectivity and so on and so forth. So I was not only concerned about the more traditional educational subjects, but I was also thinking about the impact it would have on social emotional skills and on people's mental health, which is really, I think, a major concern. And if you look at some of the data that we are seeing right now, for example, eating problems, students with eating problems are reported in pediatric units, in hospitals and so on due to the pandemic. I think this is a reason for concern. Another important element that I learned today is that the impact of the pandemic is probably not hitting every student alike. We already knew before that in education we had these inequities, but then the pandemic comes in, and these inequities, of course, have to be dealt with. And I think the effects of the pandemic will be rather different. In countries, Gregor was referring to France and talked about potential learning loss and compared results from during the pandemic with results obtained the year before. But I think even if we only see a small effect or even no effect at all across a group, this is not saying that we need not to be sensitive about specific groups within this large group. I do think that I'm a differential psychologist from background training, teaching at the University of Ghent. And I think this is a really major issue to look at. We really need to look at the differences within these large groups. So I think we need to fine-tune there, of course. A third important element, I guess, and it aligns with my concern about student social emotional development, is how students can connect. I fully agree with Tracy. She actually already made a very nice wrap up of what we learned from the pandemic in 6 points. And one of her points was that people accept now technology as a support system for education. Yeah, but on top, we also know that students learn by being among their peers, by contact with a teacher. And I think technology will something to stay, of course, in education, and will be an important element in the future anyway. And I think every policy person has to invest in this. But on top, we also need to think about how students connect with each other, how students can learn from each other, and how students can connect with teachers. We know that the teacher has a massive impact on the learning of students. And I think this is a very big challenge for the future, how we combine technology together with the idea that students belong to their peer group, that students belong to school and to a school environment, a school community. I think a lot of the learning is happening there. And then maybe as a final point, the past years, when working for the OECD, I came into contact with the Institute Ayrton Senna, and they invited me a number of years ago to be part of their EduLab 21 group. which has the lovely idea about bridging science and professional practice. And basically, I'm an academic, and I got the opportunity to interact a lot with them and to interact a lot with Brazilian schools and teachers, and setting up a nice set of studies over there. And I think this is really important for the entire group, that the professional people know that there is science that can help us out. Many people were referring to particular studies. Marcella was talking about research, Gregor was talking about his research, and Marcella actually had a very nice example, not only of listing problems, but also coming with a solution. Yeah, she talked about a nice, interesting system where technology helped students at home, together with a mother or with one of the parents, to learn languages and so on and so forth. So I think science can help a lot. And I'll finish here saying that our international contacts, we really need to learn from each other. This is, in a way, the pandemic hit everyone across the world in one or another way. So we need to deal with it. So we need to learn from each other, internationally speaking, from our different education systems, from the different opportunities that we have to deal with it, but also from very different disciplines. So I was very happy to join this group of people with a background in pediatrics. I'm a psychologist from background. There are educators here, neuroscience people, and I really think that we can offer something to the professional field. And I really like Bob's idea about that nice word that you're using, infusing science into the work in the professional field. I think our mission is there, and I hope to see each one of you contributing in the past in this tremendous task. Thank you so much.
Philip, thank you very much. And I'm going to take two of your sentences and build upon them. I think you heard, I may be, according to Roberto, I may be the only politician or former politician in this group. And so I want to take two things that you took, which in turn represented the entire presentation. Science that can help out, science that can help not only educators, but policymakers make critical decisions that need to be made. And the other one is we need to learn from one another. From a political standpoint, this is a foundational moment in, I believe, every country, almost every country, because for the very first time, the education systems of most countries have been disrupted in a way that we've not seen before. And the result is that they have to react. And how they react is going to be very important. Will they react by simply going back to the norm, going back to what existed before? And maybe for some, that will be adequate. But as the OECD note, and as I noted earlier, most nations say they want to move to something better than what they had before. They understood inequities existed. Some of them were talked about here already, but they also understand that COVID created and accelerated even more those inequities, expanded them, and also the awareness. And a separate note, I believe that there is, and I written a report on it called the COVID constituency. I do believe that across certainly my country, but I believe across the world, there has been a shared experience of sorts that can, where there's a public that's prepared to support bolder action than perhaps 2 years ago. More to come on that. But what I've learned from this series of presenters, and I want to thank very much each of you, this shows that the research that has been done, it also highlights some research that still needs to be done or is underway. We've talked about what educators are experiencing, and particularly, I think, emphasizing the stress. but also we need to talk about what educators are requesting in both research and strategies as they deal with a population that is emerging from COVID. Let me just say I'm very, very excited to be part of this conference and to see this expertise on this computer screen. And now how do we undertake that increased sharing of information that you talked about so eloquently, Philip, in your wrap up. Once again, how do we need to learn from one another? At that point, I'm going to turn it over to someone who's brought us all together, Roberto Lent, and to move to the next panel, which I believe will discuss many of these. Thank you very, very much for your participation. Roberto?
Thank you, Bob. We're just waiting for them to change the initial banner for the second roundtable, and we'll start. Roundtable. In this case, we will deal with the future of education after the pandemic, and the facts, the knowledge that we have acquired during this dramatic period. How can we use them for the future? Of course, the period was very dramatic. The losses were great. But we have a lot of novelties in technology, in assessments, and the perspectives for the future may be leveraged by this knowledge that we acquired during this period. So the idea now is to listen to other colleagues from different countries, what they think about it. What can the future wait from the knowledge that we acquired during the pandemic? So I'll call first Juan Valle Lisboa from Uruguay to tell us something about this issue. Juan, please.
Thank you, Roberto. Thank you, Bob, for the organization of this meeting and for inviting me. I'm Juan Valle Lisboa. I work in the School of Sciences in the University of La República in Uruguay. And I also direct the Interdisciplinary Center for Research in Cognition, Education, and Learning. So I'm going to try to talk, although Roberto stressed the impact of the pandemic, and I think this is what calls us together today. As Cecilia said in the last talk, I think that we have a history here. I mean, there are many things that come before, and I'm going to refer to them now. We say I believe that we need a more scientific-based education, and I think that everyone agrees with that. But I also think that we might not be in the same page when we are talking about what the science of education or for education should be. And I'm going to talk about 4 points related to this, and I'm going to end up with some kind of proposal, hopefully following on time perfectly. So my first point is that the real science that we coming from neuroscience or psychology that can impact on education and that can be used to guide how to implement technological applications in education is cognitive science. I mean that this interdisciplinary field where in neuroscience, psychology, artificial intelligence, linguistics, anthropology, and philosophy, and maybe it should be said many more, is the real level of approximation to how people learn and what we can do about it. Of course, there are many things that go on a classroom, and I'm going to talk about this in a minute. But I think that this is one of the most important points that we made from the past Latin American schools of education, cognitive and neurosciences, which is, if you really want to bridge education and neuroscience and other sciences, and especially if you want to guide any science-based education, you need to go to cognitive science. And we try to do that. And after organizing those, in part of those LA schools, we came back to Uruguay and founded the CpE, and this is what led us to create and to make many interventions in the educational setting, because we really the main idea of this Latin American schools was to bring together neuroscientists and cognitive scientists and to try to create the sciences of learning, as Tracy said today. Like, this is the field, and I think this is a field that is like applied cognitive science, I would say. Let me tell you about, this is my first point. Cognitive science is the science of behind the sciences of learning. When we try to make many of the applications and interventions that go into the field, we learn something that educators already knew, which is you need to devise your approaches in a cultural specific manner. And we know it from many different points of view, but I'm going to tell you just a little example, which is we read many papers from how children learn to read, and we've seen some talks today about that. And they have a science, but which is mainly based on opaque orthographies. So when you try to apply those ideas into the field in a country that speaks Spanish and writes and reads in Spanish, you find that the problem that the same things shouldn't be the focus of your intervention. And this, you go with your science, and you need to adapt your science to your field. I mean, this is also an obvious point, which is if you don't take into account the particulars, which means that you need to do research on your field of what works precisely on the field. So the science we need for the future, and we've been trying to develop from in the last few years, is a science which is connected to the world, connected to the scientific problems, but at the same time paying close attention to the processes that go on your own field. And I'm going to say that following with reading interventions we made for very disadvantaged populations here, we went to try to transfer our knowledge that we gained in the field experiments, and we created and adapted a digital application that was created in France to enhance the learning of reading, which is a digital application that we could have used in the pandemic, but we couldn't. I'm going to talk about this at the end. We went to the schools and we had all our ideas, and although the policy makers here are still tied to this I would say whole language methods of teaching, or whole or literacy methods of teaching, teachers in the disadvantaged schools knew that they should focus on phonics in some sense. I would say they know that because they know that from their experience. So there's a lot of experience in the teacher practice that needs to be put into context in the maybe policymakers are not aware of that, and maybe policymakers try to tell the teachers what they need to do, and teachers say, okay, we do as we are told. But we know there's another advantage of science related to education, which is to empower teachers to do what they want. And this is the third point. I think that any science of education needs to interact directly, not only with the policymakers and decision makers, but with the teachers that go into the classrooms. And so I think that the main point here is that we need and so the fourth point, which is we need if we want to make this into a science of education and to move forward, we need to train teachers. The teacher development programs that we need to create are not very different from the, I would say, from medical doctors or anything like that. I mean, we need teachers that know the science of education, but that know also the science behind that. I mean, science in the sense that they know science, they know how to read the science. Maybe they are not doing the science, but even their own innovations in classroom should be science educated, which means that we need teachers with a great deal of professional development, which goes against the way we pay them in our countries, at least. So we have teachers here that make less than, I don't know, people that clean the streets, and we want them to be like super scientists that know everything and they can go and apply everything in schools. And this is not the way to do it. And we try to make many courses of how to teach the science of education, the science of learning to educators, and we had a success, but they don't have the time and the resources to take advantage of that. So this is another point we need to take into account. When I'm going to move down now to what happened with the COVID pandemic and what we learned from that and how this interacts with that. We had this application to try to teach how to read, but unfortunately, given some limitations of the way that this should be given to the children, even though in Uruguay we have this one laptop per child, in theory, children that go to first grade in primary school, by the mid-year they get a tablet. So we had this fantastic tool that could have helped in the same way as Marcela said a few minutes ago, to enhance, to help children learn, she said vocabulary, but in our case was letter knowledge and how to build, how to read the basic words and phrases. But we couldn't use it in this case because from design purposes, we needed to have people in the classrooms. This application was directed to use in the classroom setting. So we had a problem here, which is children at home with less and few resources. We had an application that in principle could have helped them, but we didn't find the many ways to connect these worlds. And so I think that one challenge with this type of trying to make a science for education is how to create the full thing, the full environment, the full ecosystem of things that need to be in place before you can communicate both ways with teachers that want to do their own research and with our help and our things that can go into the schools. We need a much more supported ecosystem of infrastructure. And so the last point is that we need to create a new infrastructure if we want to take advantage of this science of learning to enhance education. And that's all.
Thanks a lot, Juan. And now I'll call Nancy Esteves Perez from Cuba to give us her impressions about this issue. Nancy.
Oh, hello. I'm gonna turn off my video camera because I'll be sharing my screen while I speak, because I have sometimes low connectivity, so it's more stable if I keep it turned on. So I ask your permission to do that, and I'll be sharing my screen to share my thoughts on the matter. Hello, so very briefly and directly, I think there are at least two general routes for neuroscience in this case, which is what we do, but science in general to support education. One is a more direct, directly child-centered pathway to support education, and it's in line with the spirit of the Precision Education Initiative that tries to adapt resources to specific characteristics of children, personalize the resources to try to make the most impact. In this case, I think this direct route would afford we to design informed screening tools, science-informed screening tools for the early detection of children with special education needs, because the sooner the better in terms of stimulation. Also, it affords to design highly sensitive and specific diagnostic and cognitive profiling tools to characterize these neurocognitive networks underlying achievement and in general help the design of these precision education resources. Also, it would afford to design personalized stimulation and intervention programs, of course, which derive from the previous ideas. And we could also assess the impact of these intervention programs, even at the neural level, which has been very elegantly done in recent studies, where you can see whether the results you see in behavior are the result of compensatory mechanisms being activated in the brain, or actually the function itself relies on the typically developing brain foundations that are in place in the population. A more indirect route, in line with what was explained by Juan just a few minutes ago, is of course to try to support policy making, try to disseminate information, evidence to parents and to teachers, and of course to design and support the design of curriculum for teachers, because if we can introduce this while teachers are at university, of course they will somehow be more familiar and in a better place to try to introduce this in their pedagogical practice. And also we could co-create and collaborate in the evidence, in the design of resources based in scientific evidence together with them, the social cultural factors affecting teachers' performance are very complex, as Juan just pointed out. And I think it's also another level we could include for economic science, or I don't know, these other types of sciences that can also support this side of the problem. And while we have this more, of course, expected idea of introducing wearable devices, sensors, data analysis methods, machine learning to record and inform teachers regarding the mental states, the neural responses during teaching and learning in educational settings. There are several ideas now that were tried to put in place during COVID. For instance, while trying to monitor online learning in countries that can afford this kind of alternatives. Of course, in Cuba it's harder because we don't have, access or let's say high quality connectivity across the country, and we had to rely on, let's say, TV in the TV alternative, where teachers recorded the lessons, and parents and families helped kids to access curriculum with the aid of these TV lessons that were aired weekly, 2-3 times a week, depending on the subject. In Cuba, we have some experience on this more, let's say, direct route of working with or trying to support learning. We have several brain foundation study when we have found that very specific cognitive processes co-vary with characteristics of neural networks that underlie these so-called cognitive processes and also behavior. And we have even identified the prevalence of specific learning disorders, for instance, in all over the country in two huge studies we conducted some years ago. And we have followed up the subjects that were detected during this study 12 years after, and we still see that there's a significant difference in very basic processes such as subitizing or simple addition. So it's persistent over time, and all this information has been put in place in order to create these, let's say, alternatives to help children cope with learning. Recently, due to the need of trying to extend what we have learned to have the most impact in society, we created a project that is approved in one of our national research programs that aims to create a system of instruments to longitudinally follow the development of children. All children born in Cuba are supposed to be able to be assessed at least 14 times during the first year of life, and then they undergo specific programs conducted by the Ministry of Health or Education, where they receive stimulation and are prepared to enter the schools and so on, and then they continue to be assessed during the schools. Now the idea is to create this as a network interconnected that would allow individual assessment, longitudinal follow-up, and also, of course, decision-making, the support of decision-making. This was starting to take momentum when pandemic hit. And what we did was to create an alternative to try to support the Ministry of Health and Education to assess the status or the learning status, or let's say, how were the kids doing as compared to what's expected regarding cognitive development and attainment according to their age range. And we created this application that was a collaboration between the Ministry of Health, the Cultura part of the application, and the Ministry of Education and several other institutions. This then part of the application, where you see that we would ask the family to complete a series of informations that could allow the family doctors to characterize the population they take care of. Actually, it was completed in 3 months by over 9,900 families, and it was very useful for the Ministry of Health to identify mental health issues, anxiety, some developmental delays, and of course to take action directly, because these are the families that they take care of directly in their neighborhoods. And the other part of the application was used to characterize the home environment, these conditions at home that can be very supportive and stimulating and that were critical during the pandemic to support children's access to learning. And also, somehow it was like a pre-screening questionnaire that allowed us to characterize cognitive development with regard of what was expected to the age range. And this information is going to be used by the Ministry of Education now when kids go back to schools to use as a reference, because we didn't have, we don't have this big assessments, national assessments running before the pandemic, so we don't have really a clear reference to see if there was a learning loss, or hence this could be used as a reference to compare what will happen next, and we will go to schools again and assess what is happening with the kids. So the idea is that we think there are many possibilities to use science, not only directly trying to work with the with the child and with the cognitive, emotional resources they are endowed with to be successful and to have a better quality of life, but also to empower the scientists more centered in learning or the brain to do that and to reach these huge populations. So the idea is to try to exploit technology to move forward to a more connected environment in our country, and try to take advantage of our centralization, which is really let's say, an advantage when you need to connect different ministries and try to standardize protocols of attention. So that's what I wanted to share with you, and thank you very much for inviting me to the panel today.
Thanks a lot, Nancy. And now I'll call Andrea Chiba from the United States for her talk. Andrea, please.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for inviting me, Roberto. It's lovely to be amongst such wonderful colleagues. And I am representing the Global Science of Learning Education Network, but have also been part of the US Science of Learning Centers for years when they were started. I'm a professor of cognitive science and neuroscience. So thanks, Juan Carlos, for the shout out there. I am a neuroscientist who decided they could do the most by going to a cognitive science department, actually. And I was science director for the Temporal Dynamics of Learning Center at UCSD, US Science of Learning Center, and with my many colleagues, co-founder of the Global Science of Learning Education Network. I would love to be able to share a few slides.
Sure, go ahead.
So that's the introduction. I did want to give just a little bit of the US National Science Foundation's definition of the science of learning, because it's a little different than some of the other definitions you get. The idea was to create a science of learning that had a deep scientific foundation, much like biomedicine has a deep scientific foundation. And so Su-Xiang Lim, who was the original program director of the Science of Learning, conceived of, along with her other directors, something that incorporated engineering, computer and information sciences, mathematical and physical sciences, biological and neuroscience, social and economic sciences, education, behavioral, cognitive, developmental, and linguistic sciences, all under the science of learning rubric. And the idea was that we would gain a deep scientific understanding of learning. Of course, there's much more room there for other disciplines also, but the fact would be that everything would center on actually the process and the action and the outcomes of learning. And with the Global Science of Learning, it grew out of the 6 US Science of Learning Centers, and our colleagues around the world, including Roberto and colleagues in also in Hong Kong, Australia, et cetera, sort of a moving in Argentina, and then all of you, of course. And our recent question and quest kind of is, how can we link our global networks to address learning? And that's one of our goals at the Global Science of Learning. And so our current world, we have all these events that drastically increase the need for online collaborative education tools and scientific tools. And we've, I think, perhaps never been faced with the degree of connectivity that we actually have, as we have been during the pandemic. So it's a wake-up call to remember that there really are no boundaries between countries, and that we really should be considering education of the globe in a collaborative way. So the science of learning is a multidisciplinary research area that examines the data from multiple domains to elevate learning. And we at the Global Science of Learning Education Network are hoping that we can actually merge this science around the world, recognizing that it will be very culturally and location specific, what works for whom, when, and where. And one thing that we're aiming to do and just getting started on is building a community square, which is a digital space inspired by a physical community square, enabling scientists around the world and teachers around the world with high-tech tools and perhaps a marketplace, if you will, of science of learning tools, and facilitating collaboration and learning, and also designing for some sort of feedback and in-reach into communities so that we understand what's actually working. There's As it was mentioned earlier by Gregoire, I believe, there's no guarantee that anything that works in one location will work in another. So that degree of generalization might not necessarily happen. And so it's important to get the data back so that we can reconsider best practices around the world. And so I want to give us a little reminder here that before COVID, things weren't necessarily going so well. So in the US anyway, we had sort of an SOS surrounding testing. Literally, this is a real little girl, Palia, actually, who was a wonderful artist, drew beautiful horses, and was brilliant, got A+, did horribly on her standardized tests. Well, it turned out she was so bored that she was actually drawing horses really brilliantly through the dots on the standardized tests in the US. And it sort of highlights the kind of inane capacity of what we were doing with respect to the children's perspectives. And around 2018 also, Andreas Schleicher of the OECD gave a really nice talk educating students for their future rather than the past. And so we were already on this trajectory, like, wow, things need to change. And schools weren't really working for everyone. And the idea of really teaching students how to learn, learning how to learn, became a highlight. And I think it still needs to be, particularly when we have such disparate circumstances for different children. I think the emphasis for children without resources being taught how to learn on their own, where they maybe have role models who are learning in other contexts, but not in the educational context, will need these skills. And so I want to remind everyone also, and I'm speaking to a crowd that is emphasizing this over and over again, that one size fits all view of education really needs to be revisited. Here's just one highlight from our center back in 2015 by Eric Newman and Terry Jernigan, demonstrating that children with high anxiety, actually, versus children with low anxiety have different trajectories of development of an area of the prefrontal cortex on the underside, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex of the brain, such that, this catches up. If you see it, in the 20s, perhaps around age 22 or 23, you can't quite see it moving out here. They didn't test that long, but they're different. There's differential development. And so this is just one behavioral phenotype where there's different development. And teachers probably know this intuitively when they're working with the children and try to customize their lessons to the children, et cetera. But the education system needs to remember also that things need to be more or less customized, and that brain function is differential across time. The pathways in the brain mature differentially across time in different children. And so a more unique approach needs to be taken, and understanding and sharing tools to help, I think, will be a big part of addressing this issue. I also wanted to highlight one other thing that grew from our center, from the National Science Foundation, as an exemplar of the different sorts of educational programs that are out there. And this is for our teachers in the audience. This is a program called Listening to Waves. It's a STEM education program that teaches physics through the science of music. And so going back to Palia sitting there drawing her horses, many children are not really motivated by looking at a piece of paper and answering multiple choice questions or domain knowledge, but they're really active learners. And this program mixes the digital world and it backs into physics by teaching the science of music. And you can teach very advanced physical concepts, even signal processing concepts from which our cell phones are made through the science of music. So it's been a successful STEM program. It's sort of an example of a hybrid too. It's hands-on learning, but he created a bunch of digital tools that are available globally, and the sort of thing that we would want to feature on the marketplace for teachers also. And so the pandemic was actually a new experience for Dr. Mises. He usually goes into classrooms, but this time he collaborated with colleagues, say in India, and tried the program there also. And it was a pretty exciting venture because they were able to download tools themselves with pretty minimal technology and a single touch screen in the classroom, which I recognize that many schools don't have, and engage in this group learning remotely. So it's an idea that could be replicated, and just a small idea. But with respect to bringing the world together for education and bringing our tools together and sharing and collaborating and networking across borders, I encourage us all to dream big so that we can enable dreams for our children and really think about individuality, about the science, about differences in cultures, and how we can educate a global population, not for today necessarily, but for the future. And I encourage us not to put the onus in the hands of the children too. That's anxiety promoting. I hear so much learning losses, but that really puts the responsibility on the children for a pandemic that was not theirs. But instead, how can we accelerate learning and elevate the learning opportunities for children around the globe? How can we get our technology into countries where they would like technology and use science of learning without technology in areas where that's best suited, and learn from other cultures on what works best for whom, where, and when? So thank you very much. I have further comments, of course, and could go on and on, but I do recognize that we are constrained by time here. So thank you.
Thanks a lot, Andrea. It's really very hard to put everything together in 10 minutes. I think all of you are doing it brilliantly. And now I go on to Paul Howard-Jones from England, United Kingdom, to speak. Paul, please.
Thank you, Roberta. Thank you. Thank you. Well, you've put the pressure on me now, saying everybody's doing so brilliantly, keeping to 10 minutes. So I'm going to try to do my best as well. I think an interesting issue, I think, or something interesting that I noted during the pandemic. So what happened for us is that increasingly, unlike contexts such as Cuba, our schools have really sort of become much more decentralized. The whole education system has become more decentralized. So schools really do their own thing. And that actually became true during the pandemic as well. So yes, there was some sort of general advice from the government that children should be learning remotely. But actually what that meant and how that was done, there was very little support or indication. So as a result of that, we've had some, very significant divergence in terms of how children have fared, and indeed how some schools have fared, because they took different approaches. And then, about sort of 6 months in, our inspectorate, that's the agency that goes around inspecting schools, was asked if they would do a report on what was good practice that they had come across during the pandemic. And the really interesting thing was that they commented that the schools which appeared to do best, that had actually fared the best really in terms of supporting their learners and being able to switch to this new context of teaching online and remotely, were those schools that had already received more professional development. In other words, there had been more education for the teachers. Now, we don't know what that was. I imagine it was a variety of things, but I'm sure that much of it was focused on learning. And I think that's the point which, I'd really like to sort of bring home really, is that I feel personally that the science of learning is really important in terms of being something that teachers should know about. But we have still to make that case to governments, and we and I think in a way that was a little bit of evidence that suggests that if you have more education for your teachers, they are going to be more able to adapt what they are doing because they understand what they are doing better. They're not simply following a prescription, but it's still something that we need to be actively researching, I think. And those of my friends out there will probably know that I'm actually doing less neuroimaging now, and I'm doing more talking to teachers and trying to understand exactly what happens when you talk to teachers about the science of learning in a mainstream way. So we're talking about all teachers at primary and secondary level. So let me just tell you very briefly what we're doing in terms of what that actually means. So I'm going to share some slides with you now. So this is the sort of thing that we've been talking to our teachers about. We talk about learning processes involved with engagement, with the building of knowledge, and with consolidation of knowledge. And we've picked 10 basic, not really principles, but actually processes really, which we think they ought to know about. And we've also developed this website where there are videos of teachers mentoring new teachers in terms of these concepts and talking to them about their practice and getting them to reflect critically in terms of these underlying learning processes. But as I say, the jury is still out, and we still have to prove, I feel as scientists, that this has a positive impact on what teachers actually, on how teachers think, and then what they do, and then the impact of that on children's learning. So we took one step in that direction last year. And to be able to explain that, let me just say that my feeling as to why they need to know about the science of learning is that gives them insight into the why and the how. So it takes you away from just telling teachers what they should do, and gives them insight into things that they may already be doing but can possibly do more effectively, or maybe how to change and adapt that. So daily revision, for example, we know that that's an established good practice to actually go back over what you learnt yesterday. But actually, why is it a good practice? Well, it rehearses knowledge, it helps consolidate learning, it helps you as a teacher monitor the learning, but you're also priming prior knowledge, and that means you're making it easier to connect new knowledge to it. And one of the things it does that we can't see, but we know from our science, is that when we rehearse knowledge, we actually develop multiple representations of it, and we can actually look at neuroimage scans and see the circuitry that's involved with connecting new knowledge to prior knowledge. And we also know from neuroimaging that, well, there's very clear indications anyway, that young learners, because those regions of the brain are developing, probably will need more scaffolding in order to make those connections. And then once you know that, then, this is the so part of it, then when you do your daily revision, you might be thinking, well, okay, maybe I should be revising particularly those questions that are going to actually be foundational for the lesson that we're about to do. Maybe I should be questioning in new contexts because that helps us transfer the knowledge. Maybe also those new contexts may be more engaging because we know that novelty activates the reward system, etc. So that's the basic idea. And one of the things we did to sort of demonstrate this, and we published this last year, was to look at the effect of being exposed to the science of learning on performative beliefs. And these are the sorts of things you hear from teachers quite often, saying things like a lesson must have a beginning, a middle, and an end, which sounds very reasonable, but actually it doesn't give you a lot of insight into your practice. And then scientific statements about learning, which actually don't tell you what to do, but they do offer you insight into why something might work or why something might not work. So, for example, the fact that children's brain circuitry for connecting new information to old is still developing. And we exposed, it's a funny word, exposed, but we provided professional development to teachers, just a 90-minute session. And even before the session, the data from before the session showed that actually belief in performative concepts drops off with age, which is interesting because it tends to suggest that actually this is something that you get over. You get over these simple heuristics as you develop experience. But also, the tendency to believe in science of learning concepts as being valuable tends to increase with age. Not experience, because you don't necessarily get that experience in the teaching profession, sadly. It's probably something that you're picking up outside of the professional world. But also we found that, you know, even after 6 weeks of this 90 minutes exposure to science of learning, you were still able to see effects whereby this belief in scientific concepts was increased, the adherence to performative concepts reduced. Now, we don't know if this affects practice, and we don't know if that practice then impacts on children's learning. This is what we're trying to look at now. But interestingly, another effect of the pandemic has been to draw attention to the usefulness of the teaching and learning context of being online as a context where actually, because of there are less extraneous variables, we might actually be able to study the effect of teacher beliefs on teaching and on learning in a more focused and accurate manner. So that's what we've been doing for the last year. Thank you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Paul. We have now, it's now the moment of the wrap up. So I'll call Ulla Richardson from Finland to try to do this. That's the most difficult part of the meeting, isn't it? To do the wrap up. But Ulla, please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm Ulla Richardson from Jyväskylä, Finland, University of Jyväskylä. And thank you for this opportunity to, first of all, to listen to these wonderful speakers and learn the new ideas and some old ideas as well. And sort of enforce the own ideas that I have about things. So I come from, my background is in technology enhanced language learning, and I have been developing digital educational tools for learning to read. And currently I'm also the UNESCO chair for inclusive literacy learning for all. But I don't want to say, there were so many good points in these talks that I would like to just repeat all of them. But I'll just try to say very shortly what I take home from this as a general thing. I think context of learning is important. And if we think about what, how, why, when, all these basic questions, you need to think about those when you are thinking better ways of learning about learning processes and how to support learning in the best possible way. So I like the idea that in many of these talks, the same idea came, that the context, connectivity, you need to have multidisciplinary ideas and people bringing their sort of knowledge together, empowering teachers, empowering learners, empowering even parents and scientists, that we all have something to give into this thing. But as a scientist, we also have to remember that, and we all do remember that we need data of all these things that we think and we learn, and we like to do new innovative things. We still have data to study and see whether it worked or not. So we can bring it, this sort of circular motion, that we bring it back to the practice and see new things developed. So, and also the idea of the learner, that, okay, we have cognitive abilities and we can look at the brain, the neural development, what happens in the brains with certain learning tasks, behavior of a learner in different contexts, what works for individual child in particular context. That's important. That's what we can learn. It's like in learning analytics, trying to think outside of the box in a way that okay, we know the previous knowledge, we have the knowledge of learning, but we need to take it to future. We need to think, what works individually to this child in this context? Can it be generalized at all, or to what extent in that thing? And learn that, you know, the special ways, like that this one child was learning with more sort of from the sound world, you know, music and that kind of thing. So what works to whom and in what context? And have this, someone said about the ecological approach, the ecosystem in a way, that we have learner, but learner is not just by itself. It's got something to learn and someone who's usually teaching it and how to do these things and why they're teaching. Why is it important to learn this? But, you know, and like in the last talk, Paul's talk, we said, okay, we need to know, the teachers need to know why they're doing this, what they've been doing forever. So they not just do certain things, repeat them. They need to have the knowledge and also share their own experiences to scientists who might learn from that. This might not make sense at all, but this is a very circular thing, that everything is connected to each other. And I think the wise thing to do is share it's like someone said, the world is much smaller now. The quicker we share knowledge between scientists, teachers, speak in a language that people understand in different fields, teachers understand that, policymakers understand, communication of all these important things, so that we learn what learning is. We learn to understand more about it and be open to new different ideas and understand that different methods are needed in sort of learning deeper what works to whom, when, and where. Okay, probably that's all I want to say. Active learners, active teachers, active scientists. Let's put our forces together and share everything as quickly as we can. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ulla. I would make a comment. When I started to become interested in science of learning, I was aware of that famous paper by John Brewer about building the bridge between neuroscience at that time and the schools. And he was claiming that the bridge would have a middle pillar that was cognitive science. And then after a couple of years studying this problem and trying to go deeper, I understood that we have many bridges to build, actually. We have bridges to build between different disciplines of science, because of course, it's not only neuroscientists that are involved, that must be involved with education, but also computer scientists, statisticians for assessments, sociologists, economists. And so we have a transversal bridge between different specialties, different disciplines, and different professionals. Then we have a bridge to be built between these professionals and policymakers. So people, as Bob Wise, for instance, who are able to influence policymakers in different levels of government in different countries, they have to be convinced that learning has all to do with science, and that we can accelerate a lot the advancement of education if we base our interventions on science. Then we have the bridge between science and teachers, which is very difficult because the languages are very different, because perhaps we scientists are a bit arrogant in going to teachers and asking them about their experience, about their knowledge, the knowledge that they acquire intuitively. Then there's a bridge between teachers. For instance, in Brazil, for instance, which has a very large territory, teachers in the Amazon forest, in the Amazon towns, they don't know, they don't have any contact with others in Sao Paulo or in Rio, in big metropolis. So they have to be in contact, and then we have to build this bridge as well. Our task is very hard, and I would like to close this this event by telling you that I'm very enthusiastic now. I'm very hopeful, because we somehow started to build all these bridges. We started by offering a prize to Brazilian teachers to communicate their experiences during the pandemic by making some very short videos, 2-minute videos. And we had about 250, something like that, videos sent to us. We selected 9. 9 of these videos were presented in 3 sessions, 3 panels, in August, September, and October, and commented by scientists, the members of our network. And that was a very nice experience, because we had, for instance, one of the teachers were in the Northeast Brazil, a very poor environment, and she was very, very creative, and her experience was socialized with other teachers from the whole Brazil. And then we had yesterday another part of the event that was the discussion between the scientists of our network that were dialoguing with the teachers who did the videos, and they were trying to make the connections, somehow build the bridge between the teachers and the scientists to interpret their experiences and transform them in concepts. And now we are doing the same internationally, which is another bridge that I didn't mention in the beginning. We have to build the bridge between the different countries, different regions of the world. So I think in the end, my conclusion is that we had a good start. And I hope that we can replicate this initiative in the following year. Perhaps we can get the approval of UNESCO to build our UNESCO chair on science for education. We perhaps may approximate more and more our network and the chair, if it exists, with Gisolin, which has a very nice experience, is building a very nice experience on science of learning. We have contacts with the National Science Foundation through Su Xianling, who is very, very receptive to gathering and talking and building bridges. So not to speak much more, I thank you very, very much for your participation, and let's repeat this experience perhaps next year. Thank you. And with this, I close the meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, Roberto.
Thank you, Roberto. And thank you, everyone.
Thank
Thank you,
you.
everyone.
Thanks, Roberto.
It was amazing. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thanks a lot.
Okay, bye.